Doreen 𝗏𝗓𝗓 is the
Dr. Doreen is an expert in autism.
Doreen 𝗏𝗓𝗓.
Dr. 𝗏𝗓𝗓.
Dr. Doreen 𝗏𝗓𝗓.
Dr. Doreen 𝗏𝗓𝗓 is a visionary in the field of autism. Now you can ask her questions on Ask Dr. Doreen. I love this question. Hi, thank you for the great work that you're doing. How many minutes one should give for teaching one skill in a 4-hour session? How would you decide the kid has mastered the particular skill, and how long would you keep teaching that particular skill? Do you need to revise it?
That's a very good
Woo,
question.
a lot of questions there.
It's also very hard for me to respond, unfortunately, because it depends on the difficulty level of the skill for the child. So if it is depends on a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to give you lots of information about this. So if it's a brand new skill that has never been introduced to the child before, then you probably want to give a little bit more time. Let me back up and first talk about the actual way of teaching, because there's so many different components to this. I don't want to confuse people. So when we teach a new skill, we generally will give an instruction, and as you give the instruction, you will give whatever prompting is necessary. Prompting is kind of like a thing that will make it easier. So for instance, let's say I want you to touch an object, like touch phone, and you're not doing that, and I keep saying touch phone, and you're not doing it. So next time I say touch phone, I actually touch it myself, and that is a modeling prompt. So I'm modeling for you what I want you to do, or I'll point to it. There's lots of different ways to prompt a response. So when you do that, you basically give an instruction and the prompt if you need to, and you wait a specific period of time for the child to respond, and then you reward it if the child responds correctly, okay? That specific amount of time is very important because people have different processing speeds. Some kids will respond immediately, other kids will respond in approximately the amount of time you or I would respond, and yet other kids actually need a little bit longer to process. And that is not something you know right away. That's something you identify by getting to know that child's sort of abilities. And you can generally get to know that within like a day or two of working with that child. So first, that's my first response, is that every child has a different processing speed. Okay, now separate from that, every lesson has a different inter-trial interval. So if it's a very easy lesson, like touch your nose, okay, that's done. That will be at a certain speed, whereas if I tell you to tell me what happened in school, I'm going to give you more time. The response will take more time on its own anyway. And so the inter-trial interval, the period of time that it takes to do this lesson, will take longer. And as we go into more and more complex lessons, so, you know, receptive lessons are generally easier, like put an object in a location, touch an object, give me an object, point to an object. All those types of things are generally faster than expressive responses. So lessons that require the child to say something will take a little bit longer, because the child now has to think about yourself when you're doing a foreign language. You will receive information a lot easier and faster than you will be able to produce it. So you generally have a longer period of repetition and time when it's an expressive type of lesson, okay? So that's another aspect of it. Some children will require repetitive introduction of a repetitive or repeat of an instruction multiple times. Others will get it within 3 trials. So it's very, very different for each child, and it really has a lot to do with how familiar they are with that particular concept or what you're asking them, as well as how good they are in receiving information in that modality. So some kids will do better when it's a visual skill. Some kids will do better when it's an auditory skill. It is so hard to answer this question. the other side of that is if you see a child getting bored because something is repeated so many times, then you have to move on. You have to get to another level. How do you tell? I guess, the person asking the question asked, what's the percentage correct or something? And that, again, differs. So for some children, you won't move forward unless they are at about 90% or 95% correct on something, only because in the past you've noticed that if you move forward faster, they start to confuse topics. On the other hand, with some kids, you move forward when they're at about 80 or 85% correct, because if you try to get to 90%, you've lost their attention. So these are things you learn by working with the child. Generally speaking, though, I wouldn't move past something unless it's at least 80% correct across 2 separate days and 2 separate people. So that's kind of important because sometimes a child will do really well with one person, not with another, and then that's either because the person is inadvertently prompting and no one's paying attention to it, or because the other person is not as good a teacher, or whatever it is. And sometimes they will be really paying attention today and not doing very well tomorrow, and that's important to know as well. So you want to have some level of consistency, so 2 days in a row, 2 different people, and at least 80% correct.
There we go.
And it's just hard, but with all that said, you always need to pay attention to giving the child new and interesting information. Our kids have a very, it's very easy to fall into repeating something too many times and getting the child to be bored.
Yeah. Well, the part of the question that concerns me is, how much time should you give teaching one skill in 4 hours? I just want to make sure that people realize.
That's important too. Let's talk about that.
I think it's important for people to realize that you're not just going to sit and drill one skill for 4 hours, even an hour, or even 15 minutes. That's not what it is.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. So when you're teaching a child, you are never going to be working on one skill for hours. So you identify, this is why it's so important in the beginning to identify multiple areas that you need to focus on. Yeah. So let's say I do a bunch of testing with a child and I identify, okay, I'm going to start from the very beginning. Even when you start from the very beginning, there's going to be at least somewhere between, 15 to 20 different lessons that you're focused on. So some lessons are going to be based on increasing the child's language. For example, those could be receptive lessons, like, let's say I want to teach the child body parts. Okay, I'm doing these receptively, so touch nose, touch eyes, touch this, touch that. And then you're going to have multiple other lessons. You're going to have a vocal imitation lesson where the child is working on sound production, say ah, say and so on. You're going to have another lesson which has to do with imitation. So do this, imitate this particular thing. You're going to have another lesson. So you're going to have multiple lessons, right? And each of those lessons are going to have what we call exemplars. And these exemplars are the specific item that you're teaching. So for instance, we're talking about body parts. Touch nose is a different one than touch eyes, right? Or, touch head. And you will initially start with what we call a mass trial of one particular body part, right? So touch nose, let's say. Touch nose, that's going to be on its own a mass trial. But you're not going to be repeating that for 4 hours or even an hour or even, as Shannon said, 15 minutes. All of these things are done in very, very, very small. That's why we do things like 10 trials. How long does it take to do a 10 trial set? Maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. Then you do another 10 trial set of something else. And that's why the child is receiving different types of information, not the same thing for so many hours. If you're doing a 4-hour session, which by the way is the longest session you should ever do anyway, generally sessions are something like 2 hours. And in that period of time, you're doing let's say 15-minute segments, okay, and you do 15 minutes of work followed by about 3 to 5 minutes of play. Even that 15-minute segment is broken down into multiple little lessons, and in between each of those, there's lots of reinforcers. So really, the only time that you're sitting and focusing on one thing is about a minute, maybe 30 seconds to a minute, followed by some other type of thing, which is usually a reinforcing thing. Then you come back and do another minute of either the same thing or a different thing. And so there's not a lot, people talk about repetition.
Yeah.
And the repetition is important for the purposes of learning, but too much repetition can definitely lead to the child ignoring.
I really just want to make a video showing what a typical
so
session
hard.
looks like, so
It's
that
so
people, because
hard,
once you
yeah.
see it, you go, oh,
Yep.
like it's so and you can describe it, and when you see it, you go, oh my gosh, these kids
This
are having
makes
a
sense.
ball and they're learning and they're having a good time,
But
and
that's
it's
the-
fast paced and it's
Absolutely,
moving.
it's fast-paced and fun, but that's why we tell people to always have about 15 to 20 lessons.
Yes.
Because you won't repeat.
Yes, yes. Don't forget, you can watch Ask Dr. Doreen live every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We hope to see you there.